Yeah, welcome, and we're live. Happy New Year, everybody, and welcome to the virtual DDD meetup, the first one in 2022. Our guest today is Mathias Verreas, consultant at Artling and founder of DDD Europe, and he will be talking about design and reality. Before we hit it off to Mathias, everybody who is involved here on Zoom, we will be streaming live to YouTube, so feel free to talk at any point in time, open your mic. If you don't want your face to be seen on a YouTube stream, turn off your camera and then it will not be shown. And yeah, we're happy to hear all of your comments and questions during the session. And now let's hit it off with Mathias Verreas. Welcome, Mathias.
Thank you, Marco, and thanks for having me. Yeah, so I work at Artling. We're a new software consultancy doing software strategy, design, and modeling for all kinds of clients. And yeah, we're organizing DDD Europe again. I've lost count, 6th, 7th edition in June in Amsterdam. Yeah, I'll be talking about basically I want to talk about the relationship between how we design and how we perceive reality, but I want to sort of keep it practical as well. I wrote a couple of blog posts on this topic with Rebecca Worsbrock, and I want to just start with one of those stories, and then after that we can either or even during, right? If you have questions, don't hesitate to interrupt me. Or we can, and use the Miro board, mess it up all you like, that's fine. I have a backup. Yeah, and after the story, we can either discuss or I can tell more stories, and we'll see where it goes. All right, let's get into it. So Rebecca was invited to consult for a company, I think it was 10 years ago or so, that makes hardware and software for oil rigs. And she was asked to help with object design and modeling, etc. And the team that she was working with was redesigning the control system that monitors and manages sensors and equipment. Well, the way it works, right? If you're drilling, that causes a lot of friction, right? And they add chemicals, something called drilling mud. But it's not actually a mud; it's like a fluid that they make, and it works like a lubricant, so it helps with the drilling. But it also pushes debris and rocks, etc., back up. So it's sort of lifting what you're drilling out of the hole. And so they're constantly monitoring the pressure of this, right? Of course, too much pressure is a bad thing, right? So they're always changing the composition of this drilling fluid, of this drilling mud, change the chemical composition so they have more, I don't know, more friction or less friction probably, and these sort of properties. I'm not an expert, but they're monitoring that for temperature and pressure and probably a whole bunch of things, vibration, that sort of thing. And at that point, an oil rig in the Gulf exploded. And it was all over the news, of course, and the team was quick to figure out that it was not their equipment, that it was a competitor stuff. So that was like a phew moment for them, I imagine. But of course, they start speculating, right? What happened? Could this happen with our systems? Are we missing something? Did they miss something? Of course, they probably wouldn't be able to figure out the details of what happened there if it was competitor systems. But they're sort of speculating, right? Could be faulty equipment, sensors, telemetry, communications between components, the software itself. Lots of possible points of failure there. And so what I started doing with Rebecca and the team is looking at examples and scenarios. That's always a good idea if you're in doubt, right? Look for examples. Look for the weird situations. Look for the special cases, the edge cases. Work backwards. What could cause a catastrophic condition like this? And so they were talking about this, right? What happens? What happens during these situations? How do people react, right? And they're thinking, okay, this is they go and talk to the oil rig engineers, right? The people who are actually working on these platforms. And it's a noisy environment. There's sirens blaring. There's alarms going off, and it's hard to focus, right? You're trying to fix problems. So what they do is they turn off the alarm, right? As soon as it's clear that everybody knows there's some emergency happening, they turn it off so they can focus again. They fix the problem, and that's fine. But they started, they're sort of looking into this, and what happened was, if it was an easy fix, the alarm would go off, that would be reflected in the logs, and then of course they turn it off, and the problem is fixed, and the logs are sort of representative for what happened. But if they have a much bigger failure and they turn off the alarm, then the log reflects that the alarm was turned off, but it doesn't show that the problem was still continuing, that they were still working on solving it, maybe for a longer period of time. So, these big failures are not accurately reflected in these logs, and that was like an interesting thing, right? This is you can think of something like that as a software bug, right? Oh, it's a bug, we have to fix it and deploy it, and we're good again. But you can also take this as an opportunity, right? This is a flaw in the model. This is a misunderstanding between parties about that model, which results in this problem, right? And maybe that was even a good enough model at some point in time, but maybe not anymore, right? So, and of course there are bugs that are really just bugs, right? Typos or whatever, but very often, the more interesting cases are this situation, right? There's some miscommunication or some assumptions that happen that are maybe not matching reality anymore. So, they took this opportunity, of course, and they're trying to understand what are the underlying assumptions for this model, right? And that assumption is that the alarms are connected to these emergency conditions in the world, right? So emergency condition happen, alarm sounds, alarm is turned off, emergency condition is over. That was sort of the original assumption. But as I said, that the perception of the system is distorted because this model is not good enough, or not good enough anymore, for the kind of thing they're trying to deal with, right? And so they're having discussions and thinking about this, and they realize that there's something missing, right? There's something in between. There's something missing from this model. And of course, I'm very much simplifying it, right? It's emergency happens, alarms, etc. That it was probably a lot more complex with the sensors and I don't know, thresholds for how much pressure is too much pressure, and probably even patterns, right? If there's pressure and vibrations and temperature changes, and maybe they detect patterns in that, and that raises or sounds the alarm. But so again, they're sort of they're dealing with this model being an incomplete representation of facts of the world, right? Which could result in catastrophe. So a good reason to fix it, right? There wasn't any doubt that they should look into this. So again, when you're in these sort of situations, right? If you feel or discover or experience some kind of friction between your system and how the world works, you need to look at scenarios. You need to go to any weird kind of edge case that you can come up with, any awkward situation, especially sort of the ones where if you ask somebody, whether it's a domain expert or an engineer or anybody, right? How should this work in this situation, right? What if lightning strikes at 3 places at once? What is supposed to happen? If people don't really have good answers for that, that means that there's something wrong there, right? This is why you need to look for these edge cases, because they point to situations that maybe that edge case will never happen. Maybe you just have, maybe it's even a decision we will not solve for this specific edge case. That's perfectly fine, but you should still model for it, because modeling is the cheapest thing you can do, right? If you make a mistake in a model, you grab a wiper and you try again. If you make a mistake in your implementation, in your design, and you discover that 3 years later, when your oil rig explodes, then it's much more costly. So modeling these edge cases is cheap, right? And they point, even if you're not going to solve for them, they point towards places where the model is ill understood, right? And so one of those, like for example, right? I said two lightning strikes in 3 places at once, but more realistically here, 2 separate sets of sensor measurements could raise an alarm at the same time, right? Or what happens in that situation, right? You cannot sound an alarm twice at the same time, right? It's not that they have 2 different alarm systems, they have an alarm system. So they sound the alarm. What happens with the second problem, right? Maybe people turn off the first alarm and then it starts again to indicate that there is, yes, there's another problem. But how would people interpret that, right? That might feel like, oh, this button didn't work, I'll push it again. Okay, now it's turned off. And then you wouldn't even know. Of course, there's more than just the alarm, of course, to show issues. But again, it's sort of exploring this edge case to see, where the friction in our model is. So nobody has a really good answer to that, right? So you start discussing this, and so that's probably more or less how they figured out that there is a distinction between the alarm sounding and the actual state of alertness, right? The condition in reality where we have to be alerted about these 2 different error conditions or dangerous conditions. And so, yeah, there might be all kinds of things, right? That if there could be thresholds, there could be if this alarm is or this emergency condition is considered more severe than the other, then we raise the alarm for the severe one, something like that, right? But the model didn't really allow for it. So they started understanding that there's this distinction, right? It's not some problem happens, some measurement happens, and we sound the alarm. They realized that it should be something in between, that alert condition, right? That's the name for it now. That enters the ubiquitous language, right? So the sensors detect a problem, we raise an alert condition, and from that alert condition, maybe an alarm is sounded as well. And now, of course, with this new model, you can turn off the alarm, but the condition remains, the alert condition remains. And then you separately, after you've actually fixed the problem, you can turn off the alert condition as well, right? The logs now reflect this correctly. The 2 alert conditions can coexist, even if the alarms cannot coexist, right? Is this making sense? So this, and probably it does, right? Because you're software engineers and you've seen this sort of thing. But the story helps to exemplify here that this didn't come from the domain. This wasn't from domain experts saying, oh, we need alert conditions, right? We cannot count on domain experts necessarily to give us a model. And especially because this new model is richer, right? It has a 3rd element in it. Well, it had a lot more than 3 elements, but it has a very important distinction in the middle now, which helps to decouple the situation in the real world from the alarm sounds with some new concept in between these alert conditions, right? And this new model is right. It's one of those things where you see it, you cannot unsee it, right? They start talking about this with all kinds of people, stakeholders, and it's one of those things where if you introduce it in the model, people start seeing the importance, and they can't even imagine. Like they say things like, "Why didn't we always do it like this?" Right? So you're probably, if you didn't think of this solution when I told the story, then probably now you feel like, oh, this is so obvious, right? That's not always a property of good models, but it's sort of a funny thing about them, I guess.
So
but it's,
Matthias, David Glaubman is raising his hand.
Oh,
so
yeah,
David, if you have a question, please go ahead.
Oh, so I read your what you and I'm sorry, what's her name?
Rebecca.
Worth-Brock, yeah, had written, and I thought it was a fabulous article. I think that one of the things you're saying now is, is like how to have figured that out in advance rather than in hindsight, right? And that's where you're emphasizing the looking at the edge cases as a way of proving, does your model actually help filter the reality of having a safe oil rig? Is that Is that kind of?
Yeah, that's
I don't
definitely
remember
one of
that
the.
as a strong thing,
Yeah.
as a very emphasized thing in your original article. Is that?
Yeah, and that's something that Eric Evans has always emphasized that, right? And also this idea of that you shouldn't dismiss edge cases, right? Even if it's not an edge case you're ever going to need, or you decide that it's doesn't make sense to the business to solve for it or whatever, maybe the return is way too low. But you don't know what real world edge cases you'll have, what black swan events you'll have, right? That's the definition of a black swan event, is you don't know that you'll have it, right? So you can't prepare for that. You can't make a perfect model for it. But the more of these weird edge cases you can find and at least consider solving for it, or maybe test your model against it, right? If we do this scenario, if we do this process, will our model still work for this situation? That will give you more confidence that it will also work for situations you haven't predicted, right? Yeah, that's was that your question?
Yeah. Basically, it was that, I mean, one of the things that comes up is, by looking at the model, knowing this other stuff, we think about it, and the discovery that happened after the fact, right, of someone else's already exploding, what went on is one thing, but this is a different activity. This is like trying to not future-proof your model, but test it against whatever you can throw against it, particularly if it's a life-critical thing.
Yeah, and I've always I've always advocated for managing your technical debt, right? I have a blog post called "The Wall of Technical Debt," which is sort of an easy method to do that. And so what might happen is that you discover, well, we could do this richer, more complicated model to solve for these cases, but we don't think these cases will happen. You could keep that documented somewhere and say, well, we sort of know that if we change our mind about this edge case, then we could still change to that model. And maybe we can even keep in mind, can we make our model in a way that we keep it simple, but we allow room for this complexity to be added later? That sort of thinking is, of course, it's not easy, right? Because it's always a matter of, it needs to be finished yesterday, and this new model will be more complex. And then you have this urge of maybe over-designing. But so I'm a big fan of over-designing at the whiteboard stage, right? If and only if you actually get rid of that over-design again, right? If you keep in mind that, okay, this is a great model, this feels nice, this will solve all kinds of problems, but maybe we don't do it, or maybe we even do it, or maybe we do it we write some quick tests and just a code proof of concept, right? A code probe, as Eric would call it, and see how that feels. And if it feels like, oh, this is a lot of jumping through hoops to get a simple thing done, maybe we don't do this now and we get rid of it again. But that you need to be emotionally detached from that model as well, right? You know how in DevOps they say servers are cattle, not pets. That sort of mindset apply to your models, right? Make a lot of models, try them, but get rid of them if they're not if they're too expensive, or it shouldn't be about the elegance of the model, or oh, I made this model and I'm very attached to it emotionally, which happens, right? Yeah.
If I may, I'd like
Sure.
to expand on that question. I find it always hard in these edge cases or interesting cases when we try to figure out which ones exist, right? There's a lot of second order ignorance. So we don't know what we don't know. And then you brought an example or something crazy like, what if 3 lightning strikes at once? So do you have any heuristics of when to stop looking for new edge cases, and also how to iterate, like keeping the model open to find new edge cases over time before the oil rig explodes? Like, what's your heuristic there?
Yeah, well, if your domain is oil rigs and the possibility of explosion, then of course you keep doing them until you run out of IDs. So the main heuristic is, what kind of problem are you solving? What's the value of this problem? What's the cost of mistakes? If you're, I always use the example of, if you're building a marketing website or marketing campaign website for the Christmas sales action or something, the life cycle of this thing is a few weeks or a few months maybe. What's the cost of a bad model there? Well, you're just going to hack it. If something happens in the sales, Black Friday or something, you're just going to go in there and hack it. A great model is not going to give you like a long-term benefit. Of course, if your entire business depends on the Black Friday sales and you do nothing the rest of the year, then it's a different story again. Then you have the whole year to try these scenarios and test them. And so it's very much the core heuristic is the trying to understand the return of this modeling. But you can, like, what I'm trying to point out with this story and with this idea is that you should, besides the edge cases, etc., right? But you need to look further than what the domain is offering you, right? The people who work on these oil rigs and the people who know these sensors, right? They might be experts in the domain of this telemetry or drilling and physics and geology and all these sort of domains that they might be experts in. But maybe nobody is really an expert in alarm systems, right? Or maybe they brought in an external company, but they might be there to just install the thing and do the same thing they always do and not sort of think along with you. So in the end, it comes down to, well, I use the word designers liberally, right? Everybody who has an impact on the design of the system, right? And what DDD, well, let's say the way DDD is sometimes interpreted is that it's a very linear thing, right? There's a problem space, there's domain experts, they tell you about this problem space, you model everything they're saying, all the words they're saying enter the ubiquitous language, and then you have this model and now you build it. But that's not how it works, right? That was not how it worked in this scenario either.
Then that's always the hard part when you enter a training or going to a training, because they're linear. So if you're there, people think in linear ways, but then when they go to the real life, it's like, oh, same with TDD, by the way. If you teach TDD, it's like, oh, this works brilliant. Go back to the workplace. Oh, yeah, it doesn't work so linear anymore.
And the bigger thing is that design is never linear. Good design is always the result of this sort of observation, constant observation and adaptation and acceptation, right? Well, maybe I should explain this one. Acceptation is the ideas people have about innovation is that there's a problem and somebody comes up with an innovative solution, but that's often from nowhere, right? A burst of inspiration. But what happens often is that a thing that is not meant as a solution to that problem is abused or misused in a situation. So maybe there's an emergency and somebody figures out, well, I can use this thing as maybe a simpler example. Everything in a hotel room that you can use as a bottle opener, I've probably used it as a bottle opener, even though they're not bottle openers, because you want to open a bottle and you don't have a bottle opener, you'll find something and use it. That's a low-level emergency. I use something, and then I could think, well, this actually solved my problem. Maybe I can iterate on the solution. Maybe I use the coat hanger, and from that I iterate on changing the coat hanger so it becomes more effective in opening bottles, right? And then evolution happens, right? So that process is acceptation, right? It's sort of a adaptation of something in a different circumstance for solving a different problem and then evolving it. Why was I getting to this? Well, yeah. So this whole idea of design being non-linear, right? I put up, if Marco, if you want to share the Miro board, there's the Eric's model exploration role pool, which you probably have seen, right? But I want to show how this like works in this story with the Ulrich. It's they try scenarios. They have been trying models, right? What happens if we enter this concept in the model? Does it work better or not, right? And you make mistakes, and then you do maybe a code probe, or it doesn't even have to be a code probe, right? It could be that your solution doesn't involve code, but some other approach. But it's probing, right? It's not yeah, we have this model now, let's build it. It's what's the smallest thing we can prototype that will teach us something about it.
Someone wants to say something?
Well, I was just going to say, this reminds me very much of, there's, what was it, Code Complete, I think? A book, a Microsoft book from 20 plus years ago, had this one approach called evolutionary prototyping. And I remember having, trying to start a new project with that at the same time I was first looking at Eric Evans's work. And his, you take a scenario and you sort of choose a scenario that is sort of meaty, but very, very concrete and specific, and then sort of stick a sword through it that you think is going to hit a number of organs, kind of. You really try to trying to damage it in a way to see that it's good. And the reason I was thinking of that was that when you're talking about going and trying edge cases and stuff in the early going, you're not really dealing with edge cases so much as you're dealing with these scenarios, because you're not in production yet. You're trying to see how does this model work. And you have a very small model, and then you build it up, right, with these new scenarios and these new tests of those scenarios. And that it seems to me that the kind of testing of the thing and thinking of all the edge cases may be happening sometimes later in the process than that initial exploration with the subject matter experts of co-developing that model with them. And I've always sort of disagreed with this idea of, well, there's a problem space and you're building something in a solution space. There's this space that you're exploring in a common language, right? And you're writing code, and they're trying to think of it in terms of real world, but it's the same model. It's a single model that you're trying to develop, you can both talk about, and it's one that can be implemented as well as thought about. Anyway, I sort of brought together 3 or 4 different things, sure, so I apologize for lack of coherence.
I added a graph where I'm sort of trying to, somebody's trying to move it. Can you undo whoever moved it? Or I can copy it. Yes, thank you. Yeah. So, that graph is sort of this idea of kill your darlings, right? Which is the name. I was a musician, and that's the name that writers and musicians use, etc. If somebody has if you have a great idea for a melody but it doesn't fit the overall idea of the song, you need to get rid of it. So if you don't do this kind of work, right? Scenarios and edge cases and modeling and probes, you're always going to be under designing, right? And people even say this, right? Oh, don't bother, that's over design for everything that you're trying, right? That's not a good environment, because you never know how large the distance is between what you actually did design and what a good design would be. Of course, there's no perfect design. It's an imaginary line, the green one. But then there's people where they come up with some model that solves for all these kind of situations, right? And they keep adding, and it keeps gaining more complexity. But the complexity of the model far exceeds the value of the problem it's solving, or the complexity of the problem, right? So that's why this drawing, right? The purple line is sort of oscillating over and under this perfect design, but you get some sense of where is the right design. And on top of that, of course, your domain changes, your situation evolves. You know, it needs to be it will need to adapt anyway. So that sort of habit of removing stuff that is maybe not as valuable anymore as you thought it was, that's something that rarely happens in software, right? And I think that's one of the things that makes software so expensive, that we're always dragging along old ideas that are maybe, you know, suboptimal.
Mathias.
Yeah.
Question. So Fred Brooks talks about essential and accidental complexity. Would that unbound over design also count as accidental then at some point?
Yeah, I think well, I called it here design depth in this picture, but it's on both sides, right? That is accidental complexity, right? Because you have more complexity than the domain demands. We're not modeling this is important, right? We're not modeling reality. We're creating a model that solves our problem, that is inspired by, driven by the domain, by reality, but it's not trying to reflect that, right? There was nothing, that's critical in the story, there was nothing in that oil rig environment that was called alert conditions until the designers introduced it and it became part of the ubiquitous language, right? I make a distinction between domain language and ubiquitous language. Domain language is the messy, organic language that people use in the domain. Language, it's natural language, right? It's social. People evolve terminology, adapt words to fit their needs, to help them talk about stuff, but they're not actively designing that language, right? It's the distinction between English and Esperanto. It's the same with domain language and ubiquitous language. Ubiquitous language is a designed language, a perfect, not a perfect, a deliberate attempt at finding a language without ambiguity, where everything is defined and straightforward, where everything has a single meaning within a bounded context. And that distinction is important because the domain language, we don't have it under control. It will just evolve and keep doing all kinds of weird stuff. They adapt words, they reuse words. They might have a word that has the same meaning as another word, or they might have a single word that has two meanings, or they might have two words where they think it has the same meaning, but there's really some kind of nuance in some situations that, you know, it's messy. Our job as designers, we need to gain control over this. That's, you know, that's what design is, right? You're trying to gain control over future outcomes of an environment, and especially when we're dealing with software systems, but not exclusively software systems. If we can't control the language, we cannot even, you know, reason about it and discuss it and have, you know, if we don't even know what a term means, we cannot put it in software. You know, computers are very unforgiving about this stuff. So yeah, go ahead.
No, I mean, I just wanted to ask you a question about this. I agree about domain language, but that the model is not modeling reality. Yes, it's not modeling the, I mean, the alarm is not part of its reality so much as it's this mechanism that was introduced to solve a real problem, where the real problem is, you know, you have these emergent conditions, and what happens, you know, if you have one and it solves that, but what happens if you have two? It doesn't solve that, right? So it was a imperfect solution to a real world problem. So the underlying reality is, you know, I want this oil rig to continue working and not blowing up. And what are the things that can happen? One is two things can go wrong at once, right? That is a real thing, and that is what the alert condition is a solution to recognize that situation and distinguish it from this situation where you have this alarm that goes on and off.
But if you take this point, I think I get your point at least, right? I think you're saying that maybe the oil rig is reality. The alarm was a solution, a design solution for a problem, and now there's John Gall wrote, the old solution is the new problem, right? This is what's happening here. But if you take this a step further, so the alert condition solves the problem of multiple alarms. It solves a whole bunch of other problems as well, like the logging, etc. Right? The logging was a solution. The alarms were a solution. If you take that a step further, the whole oil rig, everything we're doing there was a solution to older problems, right? Why did we start building oil rigs on the sea? Because we couldn't find, or because it was a new way of finding more oil that we couldn't find on land anymore, maybe, right? Why were we looking for oil on land? Because we had new engines that were a solution to the previous problem of, or the previous solution of steam engines. Why steam engines, right? So everything is a design solution. So if you're trying to say that something is the domain or not domain, the moment those alarms became part of these oil rigs, they are now, or the domain from our point of view, right? There's the problem space in any case. They are domain from our point of view because, well, unless we find a novel way to do this without alarms, that could have been another, right? Maybe everybody wears smartwatches that alert them or something. That could be another solution, maybe without alarms. But it's always sort of new solutions to things that are now, from our point of view as designers, our domain, and that not necessarily contain sort of the seeds for the design, right? That's what I'm trying to say here, that you can't just, like, there's this old and very insufficient heuristic of find the nouns, right? In object-oriented design, you just find all the nouns in the domain language, put them in code, add behavior, and now you have your design. Well, that was never enough, because, well, first of all, a language is more than nouns. It's processes and behaviors and rules, etc. But also because it might not exist in the domain yet, right? We have to, as designers, we have to introduce that. We come up with new terminology, with the caveat that we need to be very careful and mindful when we do, because I've seen a lot of code that is full of words that are not from the domain language, but that are not shared between designers and stakeholders in the domain, right? So that's where the friction lies, right? We do need to introduce new concepts and names for it, but we can't do it alone. So a ubiquitous language is, besides a design language, it's an agreed upon language, right? We need to have some kind of formalization and agree upon that with different stakeholders and say, are you okay with, we introduce this in the language now, in the model? Do you understand this? Can you explain this to me? As a good trick there, right?
Is it fair to say that there's a symmetry effect between physical reality, domain reality, and solution reality?
Yeah, I'll go for that. That sounds like a good summary.
And I think this is what you in the past see go wrong a lot, right? Where programmers as designers think, well, this doesn't work, so we need to change it a bit, change the concept. But there's never a feedback loop in return in that language. So then when you come back later, you're like, and even though the programmers cannot really find out the language for themselves, so they made something up out of their novel experience. While if you ask the domain expert, they will also have ideas, and that merges and creates a much more, So in the past, you see that people tried, but there's never a feedback loop in return. And hence we now call it legacy, which the intention never was that. It was a good intention, right?
Yeah. Well, somebody writes here in chat that the worst thing to happen is when developers use words that are not from the domain, and the domain expert starts to use it. Well, yes, that is a big problem in many cases, right? We train our domain experts to speak like developers, right? They come to us and say, "Oh, I need a new button in the master screen to, update this field." That's our language. They're not supposed to speak that language. That's definitely a problem. But at the same time, we sometimes need to introduce new words because they don't exist, because the concept itself maybe doesn't exist. I have this other story that would be a good place to add to tell her. If you, I don't know how much time we have. Should I do another story?
We have time for another story. Yeah.
All right. All right. So I was working for, I was consulting for a company that basically they track or they keep track of copyright holders of works, work of arts usually, right? Music, whatever. And so they would track claims on the usage, right? My work has been used in this event or whatever. You have a right to money for that, right? That's what copyright laws manage, but of course somebody needs to actually collect that money, track those claims, calculate it, get the money and make the payments to the people who should get it. And historically there have been organizations to do that. I think that the regulation changed and that private organizations could do this, or private companies could now do this, so that opened a market. And so that's more or less the space where this company was in. And they would get data from many different sources, right? They did their own research. They had offshore data cleaning, parties that they would work with. They would pull data of, publicly available data of, I don't know, wiki style kind of sources. There could be curated data that they could use. So another party is actually managing that data and cleaning it up. Or buy a license on private sources of this data. Individuals, so copyright owners could directly submit claims, or they could have there's agencies that represent these copyright holders and that do this work for them, right? These are music publishers typically. So a lot of different sources. Obviously, this company has data quality issues. There's no single source of truth for a claim. It's the data is always incomplete and inconsistent. There's a possibility for fraud, right? You could, in these public sources, you could make claims that this is your music, or that your music is played somewhere, which might not be true. And probably most people are, not trying to defraud it, but the risk exists, right? And so the engineering had, they were using event sourcing and projections that was well under control. They were basically doing data matching, right? Pulling data of these different sources, comparing it, trying to form, an opinion, let's call it, about what is true and what money they should collect and who it should be paid to. And so it's complex, right? It's all these sources. It's nobody could really explain it. They had to deal with conflicting claims. They started realizing at some point that when claims are conflicting or when claims are actually matching, that tells you something about the messiness or the correctness of this data, right? So they use that to improve their algorithms. But there were some people who sort of understood the whole thing, but they couldn't really explain it. A lot of it had sort of grown ad hoc, and it was a startup, right? So they were trying to move fast and create a business out of thin air, where often the perfect design is not really your core problem on the one hand, and on the other hand, you don't even know yet what you're doing and how you're doing it. They were inventing a way of doing this business, right? They're basically something that used to be very manual, trying to turn that into an automated business. And the code is a mess, right? It's mixing responsibilities, the kind they're pulling data, they're filtering data, they're reformatting, interpreting, applying these rules about matching data. All the cases and the rules, etc., made it all very. This process of data matching was very complicated, very technical. The domain experts weren't really, and the business stakeholders weren't really involved in this conversation either. They would just say, "Oh yeah, it's the data matching, right? The technical stuff, very technical domain." And so I wanted to do some modeling. I was actually invited for technical problems with the event sourcing, which they actually had pretty well under control. But I got curious, and I couldn't resist, I suppose. It's I don't know, it was 2015. So I convinced them that we should do some modeling. But they're like, yeah, it's not really our core domain. It's just a very technical thing. But they humored me. And we start doing this, right? And we're trying to look at the code. We're modeling the different steps and the processes, and sort of trying to pull, at least on the whiteboard, pull apart these different responsibilities in the code. Gradually, we start sort of seeing, moving from the what to the why, right? We start seeing the assumptions in those algorithms, right? Why is it doing this? Well, because of this reason or this assumption. Right, and this whole idea of if the data is in agreement, then that source is maybe more reliable, right? There's more matches with this source, this person, or this, whatever. So we trust future submissions from that source more, right? They pull more weight in this algorithm, and so yeah, we're trying to visualize that and understanding the process. And this is where this, again, this healthy obsession with language, right? Trying to find, be observant of the language, like notice stuff that is maybe being said, but that is not a concept in that language, right? And maybe if you paid attention, if you had done this sort of healthy obsession with language and you listened to me, then you would hear words like reliable, trust, agreement, pulling more weight, decisions. Right? These are all words that were not in the code, that were not in the model, but that were in the conversation between engineers. So we're trying, right? And we're playing around with it and putting these words on Post-its, and that you make them explicit that way, right? Again, these were not terms from the domain experts, right? They were not involved in this discussion at this point. But so one of those words, trust, became like a very useful thing in the conversation. We put it on the whiteboard, and it evolved from just being this conversational word to this word on the whiteboard to something that at some point somebody or me, I forgot, proposed. What if trust is an object, right? Let's explore that idea. We probably did a bunch of others as well. I'm not sure, but with trust, it started to work. We say, well, what if trust was an object? Well, it could be a value object, right? It could represent how much we trust a party, at a point in time, and put a scale to that. I think the scale was -5 to +5, right? -5 meaning we don't trust any claims from that source at all. 5 is, yeah, they're always good. So private sources that we pay for are probably more trustworthy, but we could still. So what happened here is that trust, initially only with the engineers, right? But trust entered the ubiquitous language. It became a thing in the design as well. Not just a conversational thing, not just a language thing, not just a whiteboard model thing, but an actual concept in the code at this point, right? And so we're exploring, right? Now that it's an object, you can do all the things that you can do with objects. You can pass them around. You can either modify them, but it was a value object at that point, so it wasn't modified. It was just sort of replaced by new values. You can attach behavior or computation to it. Maybe not obvious yet, but we started thinking about, trust is not static, right? Trust is a process. It's trust earning, right? A claimant could earn more trust about their claims if another source confirms this, right? Or lose trust if it turns out that there's always, like say 3 sources that say this song is written by this person, and a 4th source says no, it's written by this other person, and this happens over and over, then you lose trust in this 4th source. Of course, that's the sort of assumptions that were already in the design, but not explicit. They had just sort of grown in an ad hoc fashion. And so now we're talking about this, and we're talking to the business, and now they actually started getting involved because there's this concept now that they can talk to. Yeah, we like again, this I mentioned earlier, right? Once a word enters the model, it becomes like, why didn't we always do it like that, right? It's so obvious. Yeah, we always thought about it like that. Maybe they did, maybe they used the word, maybe they didn't, but now they feel like they always did, right? But they're involved in the conversation now. And in fact, it was people from the business who came up with well, it started with, yeah, but what if we have a source and we trust it with a value of 1, and we have another source that confirms this claim with a value of 5? Do we now trust this other source with a value of 6? No, because our scale is -5 to +5. So what actually happened is that they started proposing rules about that. And when we started sort of looking at the whole of these rules, basically we had built an arithmetic. When we realized that, we just sort of, okay, this is the arithmetic rules of changing trust over time, right? And now that we have that, those rules, if you have 0 and somebody else confirms it and they have 5, then now you have 1 or 2 or whatever, right? Those rules are now encoded in the value object, right? So the object itself can calculate the next value if you try to add multiple values together, something like that, right? And that model kept evolving, right? We started now because we had trust, we had arithmetic rules, we had processes for how that gets updated. Now we could even do sort of polymorphic strategy objects that represent different ways of assigning trust, right? If this event happens, it was event source, right? So we could really use events and projections as the mechanism for reassigning trust or updating trust or whatever. So we could even do different sets of rules, so strategies that we could replace, right? We could say for this situation or for this, I don't know, customer or publisher, or for this country maybe, we can replace this strategy with this strategy. As polymorphic, it's list of substitution, so you could have the same you have the same interface, but you don't need to understand how it works on the inside. So you can do with this approach, you can tackle a lot more complexity. They were reaching the ceiling of the complexity they could tackle with their very sort of technical ad hoc solution, lots of nested if statements, etc., right? And of course, separating the technical stuff, pulling data and formatting from the actual matching. But it changed the whole mindset, right? Data matching in the original model was a very anemic thing, right? It describes the mechanism but not the purpose, right? How are you doing this? Well, with data matching, but why are you doing this? Well, because we are modeling trust in different sources and using that to do something that I would consider really core domain, right? Their business is collecting money and paying people and trying to do that better and faster than the competitor. So it was really core domain, but because it was always expressed as such a technical thing, people didn't really see it as such, right? So it was an anemic model, not in the sense like people use the word anemic model to mean it's a CRUD system with getters and setters, which that's what it is. But this was not a simple getters and setters thing. It was a very complex, rich thing, but it was still anemic in the sense that it didn't have the purpose in the model, in the design. So trust here became like the conceptual scaffolding for the meaning of the system. Why are we doing this? Right? We could have picked something else, right? It could have been ratings or something, or I don't know what. But trust seemed to work well. Why? How did we know that it worked well? Because, well, we could talk about it in a much more compact form, right? Instead of saying, the claim from this source was corroborated by a claim from this other source. Therefore, we put more weight to this. We could just say, well, the trust for this source has increased, right? It's not reductionist. We didn't reduce anything from the problem space. We didn't lose essential information from it, but we did have a more compact way of talking about it that actually matched people's mental models better, even though nobody in the domain had ever introduced trust as a thing, right? And they were domain experts in the copyright domain, right? Copyright laws and all that stuff. But nobody was a domain expert in building an automated business for managing copyrights, right? So it's normal that it didn't exist. They were inventing this domain in a sense. And so that trust concept, right? What is it now? Where does it come from? Well, it's a metaphor, right? If you read George Lakoff, Metaphors We Live By, if you want the long explanation, the short explanation is that systems don't feel trust. Trust is a human experience, right? It's instinctive, it's irrational. You feel more trust towards, or you feel trust towards a person for whatever reason, right? But that's not a machine thing. When we say that this machine was now, or this algorithm was trusting and measuring that in sort of discrete numbers and doing arithmetic, that's math. That's not real trust. But trust served as the metaphor that sort of tied this all together. And it was the designers that introduced it, right? It didn't come from reality in that sense, right? But it allowed a lot of stuff, right? We could do maybe very smart people can manage and understand very complex code, but I can't. But with this trust concept, we could sort of organize the code around that, and it became, you could read the code and understand what it was doing, because it was talking about manipulating and evolving and earning trust, and handle the same degree of complexity without reduction, without loss, at a lower cognitive load, which means that now people without Einstein brains like me can actually handle more complexity because we have better abstractions. We could have done it maybe in the old system, but at some point it would have become prohibitively expensive, right, to add more complexity to the system because we couldn't understand it anymore, right? So this is, and you're not always going to find that, right? There's not always going to be a good metaphor. A bad metaphor is bad for your design, right? If you feel that you're squishing things into the metaphor to make it work, if you're sort of fitting your model in the metaphor as opposed to the other way around, you're going to get in trouble. But it's very, like, what we wrote in the article is, I copy pasted the quote in there. A good model helped you reason about the behavior of the system, but a good metaphor helped you reason about the desired behavior of the system, right? What is the purpose of this system? It should pay money fast to people who deserve it. How do we know they deserve it? Because we keep track of how trustworthy they are, right? That metaphor of trust tells us how we want the system to behave, right? It puts like a scaffolding of meaning around it.
This metaphor becomes business reality or domain reality after a while again, right? So it's a metaphor for now, but then it gets adopted and it becomes a new domain or part of the new domain.
Yeah. In the same way, but better. Like if the domain experts start using buttons and lists, etc., as their language, they are not buttons, right? They are metaphors for buttons in a sense, because a button is a thing, a physical thing you can click. A button on a screen is a bunch of pixels looking like a button and having some expected behavior. Here, we're also introducing a metaphor, but it's one that actually, button helps to reason about what the point is of this bunch of pixels, right? It communicates something. Here, trust communicates something, right? If you have an environment where communication is hard, that points to a possible issue with your model, right? If your model doesn't help you to lower cognitive load and talk about it without losing essential information, then it's not a good model.
Yeah, I have a question. I mean, Rebecca just wrote in chat that it's still a metaphor, even if it gets adopted by the domain experts. Yeah. So people use metaphors all the time and it stays to be a metaphor.
Yes.
And I ask myself, like, isn't it kind of like constructivism? Aren't we creating our own mental realities by using everything's metaphors, right?
All software is mental realities, right?
Yeah, right. And all words are made up metaphors with construed meaning. But so in that sense, aren't we creating reality? I mean, not physical reality, but model reality by using metaphors.
Yeah.
And adopting. Yeah.
Yeah. We are creating reality with software, right? We're doing things that weren't possible before. or we're doing them at scale and at safety and at speed and whatever that wasn't possible before. And we do this by constructing new realities, really. And we should, like, side point, right? But I see people talking about Web3, and you will be able to buy land and buy scarce goods. And is that like the most offensive thing about this whole Web3 thing? Is that the limit of your imagination, that we will be able to have all the same constraints in a virtual environment as in a real environment? How silly is that? Like, come up with something new if you want to make it appealing.
And that's something I learned many times. What I usually see is people only listen to the domain experts, but their concept is sometimes also new, right? So I was in this questionnaire domain at one point, and they say this is just a questionnaire, but it's just like a questionnaire. Okay, so it's not a questionnaire then. No, so shall we call it different then? Because if it's not a questionnaire, then but it was a well-researched domain, but they just wanted to change it. Okay, let's also change the wording, because else it will just be people coming in and say, yeah, but you're making questionnaires. No. We're not making, no, it's different. Instead of, it's just a questionnaire. No.
Yeah. The language can you can manipulate things with language, right? And let me see, how did it go again? I was consulting for a TV. Well, it wasn't a TV company. It was the state television. And well, they were more than television. They had apps and news and everything, right? They're a modern thing. But they are paid by taxpayer money, and part of their mission is to entertain the public, but also to educate the public on important things, right? And the values of democracy and all these kind of things, right? So it is a mission. And of course, this whole they're feeling the stress of things like Netflix, etc., and streaming. And of course, they're doing their own streaming. As I said, they're modern and up to date. But still, there's like it's also political, right? There's people saying, well, I pay this tax that everybody has to pay in that country to have that television, but I don't use it. I don't want to watch it. Why should I pay for it? That sort of which of course puts a stress on the budgets and everything, and the public debate. And so part of the approach was, well, to do our mission and still keep our audience, we're going to become smarter about what we're showing people, what we're suggesting, right? So they were doing a recommendation engine, and I need to think about what the So the idea was, if depending on, maybe you read something in the app, we will suggest something else. Like maybe you read about in the morning, you read on your phone while commuting about I don't know, privacy in public privacy, your rights, privacy rights. And then in the evening, maybe we show you, or we suggest to you a movie about this topic, right? So basically, they were trying to deal with this, their mission of being relevant and going one step further by suggesting the right relevant things. While working with them, I felt like this is the wrong way of looking at it, calling this recommendation engine, because then what they were building was a generic recommendation engine, the same sort of following the model of something that Netflix, I imagine they have, or probably much richer and bigger one, but whatever, right? And at some point I suggested, they didn't go for it, unfortunately, but I suggested that maybe it should be called a relevancy engine. Name it after its purpose, right? The point is not to suggest things. The Netflix suggests things because they want to keep you watching, right? If they can suggest things you want to watch that you enjoy, you will keep paying for it. But their mission was not just that. Their mission was for the public broadcasting company. Their mission was increasing the relevancy of what they were doing. So they should have called it a relevancy engine, in my opinion, and then think about the model in that sense, and not as a generic recommendation thing. And that is sort of changing reality through design, right?
I usually have my heuristic. If someone names something similar to what's already there, I start questioning, can we just buy it then?
Yeah,
That's my first question, because it's already there.
Yeah, why can't we buy a recommendation engine? Absolutely,
yeah,
right?
It's already there. So
yeah, but because
what makes you different?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So Dungeon Masters, yeah. Yeah, it's definitely there, right? You design is more than somebody says, let's build a recommendation engine, and you do some research and you build one, right? That's you solve the problem that was as described, but you didn't solve the deeper problem maybe. And that's the same thing with the trust metaphor, right? If anybody is still confused about whether trust is a metaphor in this situation, the examples from the book, for example, your career is going up, you're promoted up. There's a consistency. This is all metaphor, right? Up is a physical direction, but a career doesn't physically go up. But we use consistently in our language, the metaphor is that up is better and down is worse. And it's very, very consistent, right? So a lot of things that may not feel like metaphors anymore because everything is metaphors and you're so used to it. Your career went down the drain, right? It's down. Anything, right? Your scores went up. Lack of metaphors we live by. Somebody has the link in. I assume it's the right one. Yeah. And then in other languages, like some Eastern languages, inwards is better, outwards is worse. So you would say about something that you feel is improving, it is centering on me. It is coming inwards. It's coming towards me, or it's going away from me. Same with future and past. We say the future is ahead of us, the past is behind us. In other languages, the past is in front of you because you see the past. You see what has happened. You don't see what has not happened yet. So the future is behind you because it's invisible, right? And then everything in our language that relates to the future is forward, right? We move forward. We go forward with this plan. All this kind of stuff. That's all metaphor, and the way we capture meaning is almost exclusively through metaphor and then some sort of physical reality stuff.
Which is
but it's a really great book. It's a great read. I'm sorry?
Which is still probably emergent, even the physical reality.
Yeah. Any questions? Was the metaphors, the trust story, was that somewhat clear? Because first time I told it in public. Yeah, excellent. Yeah, locations. Rebecca says location and physicality are important when we talk abstractly, right? We relate everything in the abstract to this very tangible location and physicality stuff. Another example from the book is debate in our language. A debate or an argument is war, right? Somebody remind me, what's the language? We advance a position. We
defend our position.
We defend our position. We lost the argument. What else?
And we create whole political things around the war on drugs. We're at war with this, or we put up a good fight.
Yeah, but so an argument could be, we're standing together, looking at the problem and trying to solve it together. I think this is something Alberto said, that when you're event storming, if you're sitting at a table, you have the counterparty in front of you, and they represent the problem, and therefore they are the enemy, and you're debating and arguing. And if you stand together facing a whiteboard, you are both, the problem is visualized on the whiteboard, and you're both facing the problem. So the wall represents the problem, and the person next to you is your companion, right? I was almost going to say your comrade or your other soldier, but then I'm using the metaphor again.
So that's very interesting, Mathias. What about the issue of a Zoom kind of meeting? And I'm asking that seriously because we have our Miro board, but that's not I'm on a small laptop in my living room, so I'm looking at one or the other.
I don't know. I haven't thought about it, but I do always, most of the time, I have like the view where you see the gallery view, where you see everybody. So you're all together, I guess. I don't know. I don't know if that makes a difference.
Teams have that mode, right? You can put people together in, I think, in like a lineup where they're sitting. So Teams has sort of like that option as well.
I mean, there's still a problem if you are in a physical space and you have your comrades, friends, allies, however you call that. You have your colleagues for attacking the model next to you. There's a camaraderie because of the physical presence that you feel, right? Yeah. And what I find in Miro, having a shared image of every face helps me to understand what they feel, but it doesn't build this kind of camaraderie. But what really helps is, no matter what our physical location is, we all face the same Miro board. So I see your mouse cursor and it becomes, in my mental model, your physical representation, which is why people who use Miro for a while become more fluent in moving the cursor around a sticky that they talk about, and they group together to say, I'm in this area of the field. So you don't really need a physical body necessarily. It helps because it's easier, it's natural for us. But you can also use virtual avatars, mouse cursors to represent closeness and togetherness.
I think we're like 2 months away from Marco coming up with a model for mouse cursor body language, where based on the movements.
Well, that's what. But this thing, what you're saying, Matthias, from anthropology, they look at Africa tribes, right, where they sit in meetings in a circle. They do things in circles, which is a more round. I think there's concept. I'm not sure if it's called Ubuntu, but Ubuntu is such a concept.
Ubuntu is more the feeling of or the communality belonging. Of the belonging, stuff like that. So but we have that, right? Round tables. Camelot, we have that in our cultural psyche, but like an interview is, the classical picture of one person and then 3 people facing them, or like in American movies when a prisoner gets what's the name, like a hearing for bail, or no, parole, not for bail. Yeah, parole. At least in the movies, they always show it as like this wall of enemies that this lone prisoner must face, interrogations.
I have one problem with domain-driven design terminology in of itself. We have strategical and tactical design patterns, right? And it's always a military metaphor. And it leads to third and thought processes. So I really hate that, and I try to avoid it. But
okay. I said, wow. Okay. That's an interesting. I hadn't really thought about that. And it's a hierarchy of, besides being military, it also has this notion of hierarchy too, which is interesting.
Yeah,
and it happens in the community. Like I've tweeted about this a couple of times, and Kenny actually asked me if we could do a meetup about it. But
you're gonna do it. I've submitted it. Or did it happen?
We're doing it now, right? So what I tweeted was the last time was, when people say, tactical is not important, tactical DDD, I do strategic DDD, but most people don't understand it. That sort of meme, right? And I said, well, I linked to that blog post about the oil rig story and the trust story, and so the rule is now you have to go over these blog posts and decide which of these activities are strategic and which are tactical. And if you can solve that exercise, then you can use the words. I wouldn't be able to solve it. I don't know if finding a metaphor, is that strategic or tactical? Maybe it's tactical. Deciding to use it is strategic. I don't know. That's not. I don't think I don't get it in the book either. I'm not sure. But
I think we also move around in different levels, even when we're thinking about something that's at and I'm going to say level of detail, we bop around to very concrete things. Is that tactical then? I think we're moving around at multiple levels.
Yeah, I totally agree on the level part, and it's also different stakeholders with different weight in the discussion. Mm-hmm. So the classical tactical is more weighted on the architect and developer, while the strategical is more weighted on the business strategist and team topology designers, scrum master, whatever. Mm-hmm. but I mean, I say more weighted and not exclusively, right? Because everybody has a stake in every part. But still, I would like to find terminology that goes away from the military metaphor at some point.
So going back what Mathias said and what you're saying, Marco, and right, strategic tactical, Wortley gets it from Sun Tzu, like really old. Mathias said Web3. Can't you think of something new? So can't we design something new?
Well, I'm not even sure what
Just
problem we're solving, right?
No, that's true.
Inward, outward.
Maybe, yeah. Why not? But like, is there a problem that we're solving by using these terms? I don't know.
Or are you creating unnecessary barriers and distinctions? I've been reading this book, Sorting Things Out, which might be an interesting discussion point for a future. It was written 20 years ago, but the fact is that when we create categories and we think about them as being this or that exclusive, then we maybe are creating the problems that I think Marco might want to try to eliminate.
True.
Peter says we should replace it by on chat impressionist and realist DDD. I like it very much.
I think the metaphor carries too much weight in the wrong direction.
Who knows, right? Language meaning changes as well, right? Sorry if I interrupted you.
No. No, I think the strategic versus tactical thing is something that emerged because people needed to focus on one part or the other part of the book, which do not concentrate on the same kind of topics. One is more practical, the other is more abstract, and let's say normal developers need to read code. And when you talk about things that are more abstracted away, it's more difficult. So I think that's something that emerged somewhere. And as a natural way for people to try to grasp the concepts.
So in the words of Mathias Verreas, that would mean this is domain language that emerged naturally, organic and messy, and we're using it now.
Yep. And we're stuck with it now. And to use a quote from Marco Heimshoff, once it's in the head of the users, it's very hard to refactor.
Yes, but that might be, kind of the next thing to do in the community is try to show that those are not distinct practice; they are part of the same thing. Yeah. That just focus on different parts.
We're still trying to get rid of the word aggregate, so we still have a long way to go.
Well, what's an aggregate?
The word, by the way, not the concept.
Are you trying to get Thomas on camera here?
Well, practical patterns.
Okay, wonderful. So, yeah, let's hear around. Are there any further questions from the audience on YouTube, maybe? Kenny, can you have a look?
No, there's no questions on YouTube.
Okay.
So that sounds like a good wrap up. Yeah, I would say thank you very much, Mathias. There is a conference coming up. You want to tell people about when and where they can get into DDD?
Yeah, so DDD Europe will be in Amsterdam again, in-person conference in June, the week of June 20 to 24th. On Wednesday, well, there's always pre-conference workshops. On Wednesday is the DDD Foundations. That's sort of the event aimed at people who are already, maybe getting into DDD or are already doing it, but it's sort of talking about DDD as we are doing it. The lessons we've learned to sort of accepted practices and concepts in the community. And then the main conference on Thursday and Friday is more about where does this go next? What are the new ideas, the experiments, the looking outwards, let's call it that. And of course you can go to all these things or just pick whatever you like. Yeah, what else do I need to say about that? Yeah, we always have a lot of talks and hands-on labs and workshops and opportunities for discussion, whiteboards all over the venue so you can do modeling in the breaks. We call it modeling with strangers. You bring your ID from your work or whatever and find some random people, and there's going to be post-its and stuff so you can actually face the problem together. Yeah, that's sort of that's the event. You can get tickets at ddeurope.com and training at ddeurope.academy. And by the way, I should thank Rebecca, because this past, I don't know how long, year already, half year, we have been writing together. So these stories I told are stuff that we worked on together. You know, it's been the best thing to happen to me all year, I think. And definitely in terms of writing, I think my writing has improved a lot by working with Rebecca. So it's a great experience. Thank you.
My pleasure. It's been fun.
Will we see a book? I don't know if you like print it all together.
It's interesting because books are much weightier things than blog posts. So.
I spoke to Vladik this morning, who he said the worst mistakes I've ever made is that I agreed to write 2 books, and he's already published one that Mark was showing, but the other one he's still working on it. But he'll get there. But that doesn't encourage me to try it.
Well, so I'm looking forward to read all about the adventures of Rebecca and Matthias. Make it a nice story that collects all of your other stories into one giant book. I would be your first buyer.
Why not a Netflix series, right?
Yeah, there you go. We could just talk. So much easier than writing. Yeah.
So who's going to play Matthias?
No, just call it Talking Heads, and people will, watch it thinking.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you, everybody. See you at the next virtual DDD meetup. Thank you, Matthias. Thank you, Rebecca, for the short appearance. And everybody, have a good night and a wonderful weekend.